Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, Stieg Larsson.
Chapter 12. Sunday, May 15th to Monday, May 16th. Superintendent Torsten Edklinth, Director of Constitutional Protection at the Security Police, slowly swirled his glass of red wine and listened attentively to the CEO of Milton Security, who had called out of the blue and insisted Edklinth come to Sunday dinner at his place on Lidingö. Armansky's wife, Ritva, had made a delicious casserole. They had eaten well and talked politely about nothing in particular. Edklinth was wondering what was on Armansky's mind. After dinner, Ritva repaired to the sofa to watch TV and left them at the table. Armansky began to tell him the story of Lisbeth Salander. Edklinth and Armansky had known each other for 12 years, ever since a female member of parliament had received death threats. She'd reported the matter to the head of her party, and Parliament's security detail was informed. In due course, the matter came to the attention of the security police. At that time, personal protection had the smallest budget of any unit. The Member of Parliament was given surveillance during the course of her official appearances but was left to her own devices at the end of the working day, the time when she was obviously more vulnerable. She began to have doubts about the ability of the security police to protect her. She arrived home late one evening to discover that someone had broken in, daubed sexually explicit epithets on her living room walls, and masturbated in her bed. She immediately hired Milton Security to take over her personal protection. She did not advise Sappho of this decision. The next morning, when she was due to appear at a school in Täby, there was a confrontation between the government security forces and her Milton bodyguards. At that time, Edklinth was acting deputy chief of personal protection. He instinctively disliked a situation in which private muscle was doing what a government department was supposed to do. But he recognized that the Member of Parliament had reason enough for complaint. Instead of exacerbating the issue, he invited Milton Security's CEO to lunch. They agreed that the situation might be more serious than Sappho had at first assumed, and Edklinth realized that Armansky's people not only had the skills for the job, but also that they were as well trained and probably better equipped. They solved the immediate problem by giving Armansky's people responsibility for bodyguard services, while the security police took care of the criminal investigation and paid the bill. The two men discovered that they liked each other a good deal, and they enjoyed working together on a number of assignments in subsequent years. Edklinth had great respect for Armansky, so when he was invited to dinner and to have a private conversation, he was willing to listen. But he had not anticipated Armansky's lobbing a bomb with a sizzling fuse into his lap. "You're telling me that the security police is involved in flagrant criminal activity?" "No," Armansky said. "You misunderstand me. I'm saying that some people within the security police are involved in such activity. I don't believe that this activity is sanctioned by the leadership of CIS, or that it has government approval." Edklinth studied Mom's photographs of a man getting into a car with a registration number that began with the letters cab. "Dragan, this isn't a practical joke? I wish it were." The next morning, Edklinth was in his office at police headquarters, meticulously cleaning his glasses. He was a gray-haired man with big ears and a powerful face, but for the moment his expression was more puzzled than powerful. He had spent most of the night worrying about how to deal with the information Armansky had given him. They were not pleasant thoughts. The security police was an institution in Sweden that all parties, well, almost all, agreed had an indispensable value. This led them to distrust the group and at the same time concoct imaginative conspiracy theories about it. The scandals had undoubtedly been many, especially in the leftist radical 70s when a number of constitutional blunders had certainly occurred. But after 5 governmental, and roundly criticized, Sappho investigations, a new generation of civil servants had come through. They represented a younger school of activists recruited from the financial, weapons, and fraud units of the state police. They were officers used to investigating real crimes, not chasing political mirages. The security police had been modernized, and the Constitutional Protection Unit in particular had taken on a new, conspicuous role. Its task, as set out in the government's instructions, was to uncover and prevent threats to the internal security of the nation, that is, unlawful activity that uses violence, threat, or coercion for the purpose of altering our form of government, inducing decision-making political entities or authorities to take decisions in a certain direction, or preventing individual citizens from exercising their constitutionally protected rights and liberties. In short, to defend Swedish democracy against real or presumed anti-democratic threats. They were chiefly concerned with the anarchists and the neo-Nazis. The anarchists because they persisted in practicing civil disobedience, the neo-Nazis because they were by definition the enemies of democracy. After completing his law degree, Edclinth had worked as a prosecutor, and then 21 years ago joined the security police. He had at first worked in the field in the Personal Protection Unit, then within the Constitutional Protection Unit as an analyst and administrator. Eventually he became director of the agency, the head of the police forces responsible for the defense of Swedish democracy. He considered himself a Democrat. The Constitution had been established by Parliament, and it was his job to see that it stayed intact. Swedish democracy is based on a single premise: the right to free speech, RFS. This guarantees the inalienable right to say, think, and believe anything whatsoever. It embraces all Swedish citizens, from the crazy neo-Nazi living in the woods to the rock-throwing anarchist, and everyone in between. Every other basic right, such as the formation of government and the right to freedom of organization, are simply practical extensions of the right to free speech. On this law democracy stands or falls. All democracy has its limits, and the limits to the RFS are set by the Freedom of the Press Regulation, FP. This defines 4 restrictions on democracy. It is forbidden to publish child pornography and the depiction of certain violent sexual acts, regardless of how artistic the originator believes the depiction to be. It is forbidden to incite or exhort someone to commit a crime. It is forbidden to defame or slander another person. It is forbidden to engage in the persecution of an ethnic group. Press freedom has also been enshrined by Parliament and is based on the socially and democratically acceptable restrictions of society, that is, the social contract that makes up the framework of a civilized society. The core of the legislation states that no person has the right to harass or humiliate another person. Since RFS and FP are laws, some sort of authority is needed to guarantee the observance of these laws. In Sweden, this function is divided between 2 institutions. The first is the Office of the Prosecutor General, assigned to prosecute crimes against FP. This did not please Torsten Edclinth. In his view, the Prosecutor General was too lenient with cases concerning what were, in his view, direct crimes against the Swedish constitution. The Prosecutor General usually replied that the principle of democracy was so important that it was only in an extreme emergency that he should step in and bring a charge. This attitude, however, had come under question more and more in recent years, particularly after Robert Hard, the General Secretary of the Swedish Helsinki Committee, submitted a report which examined the Prosecutor General's lack of initiative over a number of years. The report claimed that it was almost impossible to charge and convict anyone under the law of persecution against an ethnic group. The second institution is the Security Police Division for Constitutional Protection, and Superintendent Edclinth took on this responsibility with the utmost seriousness. He thought it was the most important post a Swedish policeman could hold, and he wouldn't have exchanged his appointment for any other position in the entire Swedish legal system or police force. He was the only policeman in Sweden whose official job description was to function as a political police officer. It was a delicate task requiring great wisdom and judicial restraint, since far too many countries have shown that a political police department can easily transform itself into the principal threat to democracy. The media and the public assumed for the most part that the main function of the Constitutional Protection Unit was to keep track of Nazis and militant vegans. These types of groups did attract interest from the Constitutional Protection Unit, but a great many institutions and phenomena also fell under the auspices of the division. If the king, for example, or the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, happened to decide that Parliament should be replaced by a dictatorship, they would very swiftly come under observation by the Constitutional Protection Unit. Or, to give a second example, if a group of police officers decided to stretch the laws so that an individual's constitutionally guaranteed rights were infringed, then it was the Constitutional Protection Unit's duty to react. In such serious instances, the investigation also came under the authority of the Prosecutor General. The problem, of course, was that the Constitutional Protection Unit had only an analytical and investigative function, and no operations arm. That was why generally either the regular police or other divisions within the security police stepped in when neo-Nazis were to be arrested. In Edclinth's opinion, this state of affairs was deeply unsatisfactory. Almost every democratic country maintains an independent constitutional court in some form, with a mandate to see to it that authorities do not ride roughshod over the democratic process. In Sweden, the task is that of the Prosecutor General or the Parliamentary Ombudsman, who, however, can only pursue recommendations forwarded to them by other departments. If Sweden had a constitutional court, then Salander's lawyer could instantly charge the Swedish government with the violation of her constitutional rights. The court could then order all the documents on the table and summon anyone it pleased, including the Prime Minister, to testify until the matter was resolved. But in the current situation, the most her lawyer could do was file a report with the Parliamentary Ombudsman, who didn't have the authority to walk into the security police and start demanding documents and other evidence. Over the years, Edclinth had been an impassioned advocate of the establishment of a constitutional court. He could then more easily act upon the information he had been given by Armansky. But as things stood, Edclinth lacked the legal authority to initiate a preliminary investigation. He took a pinch of snuff. If Armansky's information was correct, security police officers in senior positions had looked the other way when a series of savage assaults were committed against a Swedish woman. Then her daughter was locked up in a mental hospital on the basis of a fabricated diagnosis. Finally, they had given carte blanche to a former Soviet intelligence officer to commit crimes involving weapons, narcotics, and sex trafficking. Edclinth grimaced. He did not even want to begin to estimate how many counts of illegal activity must have taken place. Not to mention the burglary at Blomqvist's apartment, the attack on Salander's lawyer, which Edclinth could not bring himself to accept was part of the same pattern, and possible involvement in the murder of Zalachenko. It was a mess, and Edclinth didn't feel the slightest desire to get mixed up in it. Unfortunately, he had become involved from the moment Armansky invited him to dinner. How now to handle the situation? Technically, the answer was simple. If Armansky's account was true, Lisbeth Salander had at the very least been deprived of the opportunity to exercise her constitutionally protected rights and liberties. From a constitutional standpoint, this was the first can of worms. Decision-making political bodies had been induced to make certain decisions. This too touched on the core of the responsibility delegated to the Constitutional Protection Unit. Edclinth, a policeman, had knowledge of a crime, and thus he had the obligation to submit a report to a prosecutor. In real life, the answer was not so simple. It was, to put it mildly, complicated. Inspector Monica Figueroa, in spite of her unusual name, was born in Dalarna to a family that had lived in Sweden at least since the time of Gustavus Vasa in the 16th century. She was a woman whom people usually paid attention to, for several reasons. She was 36, blue-eyed, and 6 feet tall. She had short, light blonde, naturally curly hair. She was attractive and dressed in a way that she knew made her more so. And she was in exceptionally good shape. She had been a top-level gymnast in her teens and almost qualified for the Olympic team when she was 17. She had given up classic gymnastics but still worked out obsessively at the gym 5 nights a week. She exercised so often that the endorphins her body produced functioned as a drug that made it difficult for her to stop training. She ran, lifted weights, played tennis, did karate. She had cut back on bodybuilding, that extreme variant of bodily glorification, some years ago. In those days she was spending 2 hours a day pumping iron. Even so, she trained so hard and her body was so muscular that malicious colleagues still called her hair Figueroa. When she wore a sleeveless t-shirt or a summer dress, no one could fail to notice her biceps and powerful shoulders. Her intelligence too intimidated many of her male colleagues. She had left school with top grades, studied to become a police officer at 20, then served for 9 years in Uppsala and studied law in her spare time. For fun, she said, she had also studied for a degree in political science. When she left patrol duty to become a criminal inspector, it was a great loss to Uppsala street safety. She worked first in the Violent Crimes Division and then in the unit that specialized in financial crime. In 2000 she applied to the security police in Uppsala, and by 2001 she had moved to Stockholm. She first worked in counter-espionage, but she was almost immediately handpicked by Edclinth for the Constitutional Protection Unit. He happened to know Figuerola's father and had followed her career over the years. When at long last Edclinth concluded that he had to act on Armansky's information, he called Figuerola into his office. She had been at Constitutional Protection for less than 3 years, which meant she was still more of a real police officer than a desk warrior. She was dressed that day in tight blue jeans, turquoise sandals with a low heel, and a navy blue jacket. "What are you working on at the moment, Monica?" "We're following up on the robbery of the grocers in Sun." Figuerola was the head of a department of 5 officers working on political crimes. They relied heavily on computers connected to the incident reporting network of the regular police. Nearly every report submitted in any police district in Sweden passed through the computers in Figuerola's department. The software scanned every report and reacted to 310 keywords: nigger, for example, or skinhead, swastika, immigrant, anarchist, Hitler salute, Nazi, National Democrat, traitor, Jew lover, or nigger lover. If such a keyword cropped up, the report would be printed out and scrutinized. The Constitutional Protection Unit publishes an annual report, Threats to National Security, which supplies the only reliable statistics on political crime. These statistics are based on reports filed with local police authorities. The security police did not normally spend time investigating robberies of groceries, but in the case of the robbery of the shop in Sun, the computer had reacted to 3 keywords: immigrant, shoulder patch, and nigger. 2 masked men had robbed at gunpoint a shop owned by an immigrant. They had taken 2,780 kroner and a carton of cigarettes. One of the robbers had a mid-length jacket with a Swedish flag shoulder patch. The other had screamed, "Fucking nigger," several times at the manager and forced him to lie on the floor. This was enough for Figuerola's team to initiate the preliminary investigation. To inquire whether the robbers had a connection to the neo-Nazi gang in Värmland, and whether the robbery could be defined as a racist crime. If so, the incident might be included in that year's statistical compilation, which would then itself be incorporated within the European statistics put together by the EU's office in Vienna. "I have a difficult assignment for you," Edclinth said. "It's a job that could land you in big trouble. Your career might be ruined. But if things go well, it could be a major step forward for you." "I'm all ears." "I'm thinking of moving you to the Constitutional Protection Operations Unit." "Forgive me for mentioning this, but Constitutional Protection doesn't have an operations unit." "Yes, it does," Edclinth said. "I established it this morning. At present it consists of you." "I see," said Figuerola hesitantly. "The task of constitutional protection is to defend the Constitution against what we call internal threats, most often those on the extreme left or the extreme right. But what do we do if a threat to the Constitution comes from within our own organization?" For the next half hour he told her what Armansky had told him the night before. "Who is the source of these claims?" Figuerola said when the story was ended. "Focus on the information, not the source. What I'm wondering is whether you consider the source to be reliable." "I consider the source to be totally reliable. I've known this person for many years." "It all sounds a bit, I don't know, improbable?" "I know. It's the stuff of a spy novel." "How do you expect me to go about tackling it?" "Starting now, you're released from all other duties. Your task, your only task, is to investigate the truth of this story." You have to either verify or dismiss the claims one by one. You report directly and only to me. I see what you mean when you say I might land in it up to my neck. But if the story is true, if even a fraction of it is true, then we have a constitutional crisis on our hands. Where do you want me to begin? Start with the simple things. First, read the Bjork report. Then identify the people who are allegedly tailing this guy Blomkvist. According to my source, the car belongs to Goran Martinsson, a police officer living on Vatangigatan in Vällingby. Then identify the other person in the pictures taken by Blomkvist's photographer. The younger blonde man here. Figueroa was making notes. Then look into Gullberg's background. I'd never heard his name before, but my source believes there's a connection between him and the security police. So somebody here at SIS put out a contract on a former spy using a 78-year-old man. I don't believe it. Nevertheless, check it out. Your entire investigation has to be carried out without a single person other than me knowing anything at all about it. Before you take any action, I want to be informed. I don't want to see any rings on the water. This is one hell of an investigation. How am I going to do all this alone? You won't have to. You have to do only the first check. If you come back and say that you didn't find anything, then everything is fine. If you come back having found anything as my source describes it, then we'll decide what to do. Figueroa spent her lunch hour pumping iron in the police gym. Lunch consisted of black coffee and a meatball sandwich with beet salad, which she took back to her office. She closed her door, cleared her desk, and started reading the Bjork report while she ate. She also read the appendix with the correspondence between Bjork and Dr. Teleborian. She made a note of every name and every incident in the report that had to be verified. After 2 hours she got up, went to the coffee machine, and got a refill. When she left her office she locked the door, part of the routine at SIS. Back at her desk, the first thing she did was check the report's protocol number. She called the registrar and was informed that no report with that protocol number existed. Her second check was to consult a media archive. That yielded better results. The evening papers and a morning paper had reported a person being badly injured in a car fire on Lundagatan on the date in question in 1991. The victim of the incident was a middle-aged man, but no name was given. One evening paper reported that, according to a witness, the fire had been started deliberately by a young girl. Gunnar Bjork, the author of the report, was a real person. He was a senior official in the immigration unit, lately on sick leave and now, very recently, deceased, a suicide. The personnel department had no information about what Bjork had been working on in 1991. The file was stamped top secret, even for other employees at SIS. Which was routine. It was a straightforward matter to establish that Salander had lived with her mother and twin sister on Lundagatan in 1991 and spent the following 2 years at St. Stefan's Children's Psychiatric Clinic. In these sections at least, the record corresponded with the report's contents. Peter Teleborian, now a well-known psychiatrist often seen on TV, had worked at St. Stefan's in 1991 and was today its senior physician. Figueroa then called the assistant head of the personnel department. We're working on an analysis here in CP that requires evaluating a person's credibility and general mental health. I need to consult a psychiatrist or some other professional who's approved to handle classified information. Dr. Peter Teleborian was mentioned to me, and I was wondering whether I could hire him. It took a while before she got an answer. Dr. Teleborian has been an external consultant for SIS in a couple of instances. He has security clearance, and you can discuss classified information with him in general terms. But before you approach him, you have to follow the bureaucratic procedure. Your supervisor must approve the consultation and make a formal request for you to be allowed to approach Drive. Teleborian. Her heart sank. She had verified something that could be known only to a very restricted group of people. Teleborian had indeed had dealings with SIS. She put down the report and focused her attention on other aspects of the information that Edclinth had given her. She studied the photographs of the two men who had allegedly followed the journalist Blomqvist from Café Copacabana on May 1st. She consulted the vehicle registry and found that Goran Martinsson was the owner of a grey Volvo with the registration number legible in the photographs. Then she got confirmation from the SIS personnel department that he was employed there. Her heart sank again. Martinsson worked in personal protection. He was a bodyguard. He was one of the officers responsible on formal occasions for the safety of the Prime Minister. For the past few weeks he had been loaned to counter-espionage. His leave of absence had begun on April 10, a couple of days after Zalachenko and Salander had landed in Solgrenska Hospital. But that sort of temporary reassignment was not unusual, covering a shortage of personnel here or there in an emergency situation. Then Figueroa called the assistant chief of counter-espionage, a man she knew and had worked for during her short time in that department. Was Goran Martinsson working on anything important, or could he be borrowed for an investigation in constitutional protection? The assistant chief of counter-espionage was puzzled. Inspector Figueroa must have been misinformed. Martinsson had not been reassigned to counter-espionage. Sorry. Figueroa stared at her receiver for 2 minutes. In personal protection they believed that Martinsson had been loaned out to counter-espionage. Counter-espionage said that they definitely had not borrowed him. Transfers of that kind had to be approved by the chief of secretariat. She reached for the phone to call him, but stopped short. If personal protection had loaned out Martinsson, then the chief of secretariat must have approved the decision. But Martinsson was not a counter-espionage, which the chief of secretariat must be aware of. And if Martinsson was loaned out to some department that was tailing journalists, then the chief of secretariat would have to know about that too. Edclinth had told her he didn't want any rings in the water. To raise the matter with the chief of secretariat might be to chuck a very large stone into a pond. Berger sat at her desk in the glass cage. It was 10:30 on Monday morning. She badly needed the cup of coffee she had just gotten from the machine in the cafeteria. The first hours of her workday had been taken up entirely with meetings, starting with one lasting 15 minutes in which assistant editor Fredriksson presented the guidelines for the day's work. She was increasingly dependent on Fredriksson's judgment due to her loss of confidence in Anders Holm. The second was an hour-long meeting with the CEO, Magnus Bergzio. SMPs carbon monohypofluoride, Christer Sellberg. And Ulf Floden, the budget chief. The discussion was about the slump in advertising and the downturn in single-copy sales. The budget chief and the CFO were both determined to cut the newspaper's overhead. We made it through the first quarter of this year thanks to a marginal rise in advertising sales and the fact that 2 senior, highly paid employees retired. Those positions have not been filled, Floden said. We'll probably close out the present quarter with a small deficit. But the free papers, Metro and Stockholm City, are cutting into our ad revenue in Stockholm. My prognosis is that the third quarter will produce a significant loss. So how do we counter that? Bergzio said. The only option is cutbacks. We haven't laid anyone off since 2002. But before the end of the year we will have to eliminate 10 positions. Which positions? Berger said. We need to work on the cheese plane principle. Shave a job here and a job there. The sports desk has 6.5 jobs at the moment. We should cut that to 5 full-timers. As I understand it, the sports desk is on its knees already. What you're proposing means that we'll have to cut back on sports coverage. Floden shrugged. I'll gladly listen to other suggestions. I don't have any better suggestions, but the principle is this. If we cut personnel, then we have to produce a smaller newspaper, and if we make a smaller newspaper, the number of readers will drop, and the number of advertisers too. The eternal vicious circle, Sellberg said. I was hired to turn this downward trend around, said Berger. I see my job as taking an aggressive approach to change the newspaper and make it more attractive to readers. I can't do that if I have to cut staff. She turned to Bergzio. How long can the paper continue to bleed? How big a deficit can we take before we hit the limit? Bergzio pursed his lips. Since the early 90s, S&P has eaten into a great many old consolidated assets. We have a stock portfolio that has dropped in value by about 30% compared to 10 years ago. A large portion of these funds were used for investments in IT. We've also had enormous expenses. I gather that S&P has developed its own text editing system, the AXT. What did that cost? About 5 million kroner to develop. Why did S&P go to the trouble of developing its own software? There are inexpensive commercial programs already on the market. Well, Erica, that may be true. Our former IT chief talked us into it. He persuaded us that it would be less expensive in the long run, and that S&P would also be able to license the program to other newspapers. Did any of them buy it? Yes, as a matter of fact, a local paper in Norway. Meanwhile, Berger said in a dry voice, we're sitting here with PCs that are 5 or 6 years old. Ellipsis quote. It's simply out of the question that we invest in new computers in the coming year, Floden said. The discussion had gone back and forth. Berger was aware that her objections were being systematically stonewalled by Floden and Selberg. For them, cost-cutting was what counted, which was understandable enough from the point of view of a budget chief and a CFO, but it was unacceptable for a newly appointed editor-in-chief. What irritated her most was that they kept brushing off her arguments with patronizing smiles, making her feel like a teenager being quizzed on her homework. Without actually uttering a single inappropriate word, they displayed an attitude that was so antediluvian it was almost comical. You shouldn't worry your pretty head over complex matters, little girl. Bergzio wasn't much help. She didn't sense the same condescension from him, but he was biding his time and letting the other participants at the meeting say their piece. She sighed and plugged in her laptop. She had 19 new emails. 4 were spam. Someone wanted to sell her Viagra, cybersex with the sexiest lolitas on the net for only $4 per minute, animal sex, the juiciest horsefuck in the universe, and a subscription to fashion.nu. The tide of this crap never receded, no matter how many times she tried to block it. Another 7 messages were those so-called Nigeria letters from the widow of the former head of a bank in Abu Dhabi offering her ludicrous sums of money if she would only assist with a small sum of startup money, and other such junk. There was the morning memo, the lunchtime memo, 3 emails from Fredrickson updating her on developments in the day's lead story, one from her accountant, who wanted a meeting to discuss the implications of her move from Millennium to S&P, and a message from her dental hygienist suggesting a time for her quarterly visit. She put the appointment in her calendar and realized at once that she would have to change it because she had a major editorial conference planned for that day. Finally, she opened the last one, sent from centraled@smpost.se, with the subject line. ATTN. Editor-in-Chief. Slowly she put down her coffee cup. You whore. You think you're something, you fucking cunt. Don't think you can come here and throw your weight around. You're going to get fucked in the cunt with a screwdriver, whore. The sooner you disappear the better. Berger looked up and searched for the news editor, home. He was not at his desk, nor could she see him in the newsroom. She checked the sender and then picked up the phone and called Peter Fleming, the IT manager. Good morning, Peter. Who uses the address, centraled@smpost.se? That isn't a valid address at SMP. I just got an email from that address. It's a fake. Does the message contain a virus? I wouldn't know. At least, the antivirus program didn't react. Okay. It's very simple to fake an apparently legitimate address. There are sites on the net that you can use to send anonymous mail. Is it possible to trace an email like that? Almost impossible, even if the person in question is so stupid that he sends it from his home computer. You might be able to trace the IP number to a server, but if he uses an account that he set up at Hotmail, for instance, the trail will fizzle out. Berger thanked him. She thought for a moment. It was not the first time she had received a threatening email or a message from a crackpot. This one was obviously referring to her new job as editor-in-chief. She wondered whether it was some lunatic who had read about her in connection with Miranda's death, or whether the sender was in the building. Figueroa thought long and hard about how to investigate Gullberg. One advantage of working at Constitutional Protection was that she had the authority to access almost any police report in Sweden that might have any connection to racially or politically motivated crimes. Zalachenko was technically an immigrant, and her job included tracking violence against persons born abroad to decide whether or not the crime was racially motivated. Accordingly, she had the right to involve herself in the investigation of Zalachenko's murder, to determine whether Gullberg, the known killer, had a connection to any racist organization, or whether he was overheard making racist remarks at the time of the murder. She requisitioned the report. She found the letters that had been sent to the Minister of Justice and discovered that alongside the diatribe and the insulting personal attacks were also the words nigger lover and traitor. By then it was 5:00 p.m. Figueroa locked all the material in her safe, shut down her computer, washed her coffee mug, and clocked out. She walked briskly to a gym at St. Eriksplan and spent the next hour doing some easy strength training. When she was finished, she went home to her one-bedroom apartment on Pontongergatan, showered, and ate a late but nutritious dinner. She considered calling Daniel Mogren, who lived 3 blocks down the same street. Mogren was a carpenter and bodybuilder and had been her training partner off and on for 3 years. In recent months they had also had sex as friends. Sex was almost as satisfying as a rigorous workout at the gym, but at a mature 30+, or rather, 40-. Figueroa had begun to think that maybe she ought to start looking for a steady partner and a more permanent living arrangement. Maybe even children. But not with Mogren. She decided that she didn't feel like seeing anyone that evening. Instead, she went to bed with a book on the history of the ancient world.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.